Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going deep on a guy who should be really interesting for anyone who, is into philosophy. Galen of Pergamon. So you probably mostly know him as like a big name in the history of medicine, someone who had a huge impact on medical thought for over 1,000 years. But we're not focusing on that side of him so much today. We're here to explore his deep and maybe kind of hidden engagement with the philosophical debates that were happening back then.
Right. Galen, who lived from 129 to around 200 CE, he wasn't just some skilled doctor. I mean, he had this really deep intellectual curiosity, the kind that led him to grapple with a lot of those big questions that, philosophers are still thinking about today. And his writing, wow, it was immense. Over 21 volumes, so that's more than 4 million words. And get this, most of his scientific and medical stuff survived, but a lot of his writings that were straight up philosophical, they're lost.
So, I guess for someone like you, a real philosophy buff, the first question is if we've lost so much of his direct philosophical work, what can we even learn about his philosophical thinking? Is this deep dive even worth it?
That's the really interesting challenge here. Try to figure out Galen's philosophy is kind of putting together a puzzle where some of the pieces are missing. A lot of his philosophical ideas, they're kind of buried within those massive medical writings of his, scattered across all sorts of genres, from anatomy stuff to commentaries on Hippocrates. And to make things even trickier, the way he used philosophical terms, it's not always the same as what you'd find in the established schools of philosophy back then. And yeah, losing those dedicated philosophical treatises of his, that definitely leaves some gaps in our understanding.
So today, our mission is to dive into this rich but complicated world of Galen's and try to pull out those philosophical insights that are still there, especially for you, a fellow lover of wisdom. We want to really bring to light those philosophical things that Galen was doing, the stuff that might connect with your own philosophical questions. Think of us like, guides on a hike. We're here to help you make sense of his unique way of looking at these fundamental questions, starting from the very nature of knowledge to the complicated inner workings of the mind and even, the principles that guide us to a good life.
Exactly. We're going to be digging into his approach to epistemology, which is all about that rigorous search for solid, reliable knowledge. We'll look at his work in logic, his understanding of how things happen in the world, what we call causation. And then we'll get into his intricate philosophy of mind and even the ethical framework that he put together. It's going to be a journey into the mind of this, brilliant and complex thinker who, even though he didn't always call himself a philosopher, he was definitely grappling with a lot of philosophical problems.
So tell me, who was this guy, this intellectual powerhouse? What were the things that shaped his way of looking at the world, his philosophical outlook?
Okay, so Galen was born in Pergamon, a pretty important city back then in what's now Turkey. His family was part of the intellectual elite. And Galen himself, he talked a lot about how crucial his early education was, especially in math and geometry. He saw those subjects as providing models for, really solid proof, something that he thought was, kind of missing in many of the philosophical discussions of his time. This early emphasis on, mathematical rigor, it gave Galen a powerful way to critique those philosophical debates back then, which he sometimes saw as being a bit loose in their arguments. He wanted that same level of, demonstrable proof when it came to philosophical claims, and that really set him apart from other thinkers who maybe relied more on rhetoric or tradition. And on top of that, he thought math was essential for fighting back against this growing wave of skepticism that was around.
That's interesting. Math is a shield against philosophical doubt, huh? It's a cool connection.
Yeah.
How did that play out in his later work?
That's the fascinating part. This early focus on mathematical reasoning probably had a huge influence on his later approach to both science and philosophy, It pushed him to look for clarity and demonstrable certainty in his explanations. And so, from the age of 14, he starts his formal education in philosophy, attending lectures from all the major Hellenistic schools, Platonists, Aristotelians, Stoics, you name it. And that right there shows how philosophically eclectic he was. He was exposed to Plato's ideas about forms, Aristotle's emphasis on observing the world, the Stoics' focus on virtue and reason, and even the Epicurean pursuit of pleasure.
So he was pulling from all over the place, not like those philosophers who stuck with just one school. Was that a conscious choice?
Yeah, absolutely. Galen's philosophical, cherry picking, let's call it that, it wasn't random. It showed this practical side of him. He was after those useful insights, the sound arguments, regardless of which school they came from. It's kind of like what you see later on when people try to bring together different philosophical systems. But it also means he wasn't always totally invested in the basic principles of any one school. Then, at 16, he starts studying medicine right alongside his philosophy. And when his dad dies, he travels all over the place for more medical training, spending a lot of time in Alexandria.
Alexandria, I mean, that was like the intellectual hub of the ancient world. What did he find there?
In Alexandria, it's pretty likely he got some serious training in anatomy, although, doing dissections on humans was limited back then. And this is really important, he immersed himself in this whole tradition of commenting on classical texts, especially the writings of Hippocrates and his followers. That stuff was like the bedrock of ancient medicine. And this practice of really digging into and interpreting these authoritative texts, it became central to Galen's own writing and how he thought about the world.
So we've got this guy with a crazy broad base in both philosophy and medicine. He's immersed himself in all the big intellectual currents of the time. What does he do with all this?
Well, he moves to Rome in the early 160s, and he doesn't waste any time. He quickly becomes this prominent figure among Rome's intellectual elite, which included, by the way, a bunch of Aristotelian philosophers. He establishes himself as this, kind of flashy and self-promoting doctor, giving public lectures and doing these anatomical demos in this very competitive environment. And this is when his super prolific writing career takes off.
He's really starting to make a name for himself now. What were some of those impactful works he was producing?
In this early Roman period, he starts on two of his most important works. First, there's The Function of the Parts of the Body, where he goes into meticulous detail, arguing that every single anatomical feature has a purpose, even a divinely inspired one. He's drawing heavily on Aristotle's work in biology here. And then there's the Doctrines of Hippocrates and Plato, a major work where he lays out Plato's tripartite psychology, the idea that the soul has these rational, spirited, and desiring parts. And he tries to bring that together with his own understanding of how the brain, heart, and liver work. He even describes this dramatic experiment where he demonstrates how crucial the brain is by, get this, tying off the spinal cord of a live pig.
Now that's some direct empirical evidence. So he's at the center of the Roman intellectual scene, eventually becoming the court physician to Marcus Aurelius, who was a philosopher king himself. Things must have been going pretty well for him.
Yeah, you could say that. Being the court physician gave him this privileged spot. It probably gave him the time and the resources to do all that writing. And he kept that court job under Marcus Aurelius' successors, Commodus and Septimius Severus. He even lived through the craziness of Commodus' reign and this terrible fire in 192 CE that wiped out a big chunk of his personal library. It's in this later period that he finishes his huge work, The Method of Healing. He also writes a ton on pharmacology and produces these huge commentaries on all that Hippocratic writing.
With all that output in medicine and science, it's clear philosophy was still a big deal to him. How did philosophy actually show up in his work?
Oh, absolutely. Towards the end of his life, he even writes what some people consider his philosophical testament. It's called My Own Doctrines. It's a pretty concise look at his philosophical views on a bunch of big questions. And this is really important to remember, especially for our philosophy-minded listeners. Even though he knew a ton about Greek philosophy and all its fancy terminology, he often pushed back against what he saw as the dogmatism of the established schools. And he specifically didn't identify with any particular school.
There's that tension again. Totally into philosophical ideas, but not wanting to be labeled as a philosopher from any one tradition.
I think it shows his independent spirit. And maybe a little skepticism about how rigid he saw some of those philosophical schools. To really grasp how deep his philosophical engagement went, we should look at some of the ways philosophy shaped his work. There are at least 3 key roles that stand out.
Okay, let's hear them. What were those fundamental roles philosophy played in Galen's intellectual life?
First, and Galen himself was big on this point, was the idea of demonstration, what they called apodexis. For him, this was like the foundation. Reliable knowledge, solid explanations of the natural world, it all had to be built on this. It was the essential tool for telling good arguments from bad ones and making sure the conclusions you reached were actually trustworthy. It was like the gold standard for getting to the truth.
So it was a rigorous way to reach certainty. How did that connect to his scientific work?
Exactly. Second, his scientific and medical explanations weren't developed in some kind of philosophical void. When he was tackling these big questions about the fundamental elements of the universe or how causation and change work, he was right there in the middle of all these ongoing philosophical debates. He would often use established philosophical categories like telos, the concept of purpose or an end goal, and that essential difference between form and matter. He used those as frameworks for his scientific understanding. Even in areas that we might see as purely medical today, things like his theory of health or how he classified different kinds of pulses and diseases, you see this drive towards really precise definitions, logical divisions, and a consistent use of philosophical vocabulary.
So it's like philosophy wasn't just some separate intellectual hobby. It gave him the tools to think about his scientific investigations.
Exactly. And third, there were certain areas within philosophy itself that didn't directly tie into his medical or scientific work, but they were still super important to him intellectually. Ethics is a prime example. He also did some interesting work in logic and even delved into linguistic theory, offering his own take on these subjects.
Okay, and what about the study of the mind? What we'd call philosophy of mind or psychology today. Where did that fit in?
That's a good question. Studying the sucha, or soul, that sits in this really fascinating and complex middle ground in Galen's thought. When he talks about the sucha, it's all woven together with established philosophical traditions, especially Platonism, and his own detailed medical and physiological theories about how the body works. It's like this bridge connecting his scientific view of the physical body with his philosophical understanding of the mental realm.
It sounds like a very integrated intellectual life. Let's go deeper into one of these areas, his epistemology, his theory of knowledge. For our listeners who are into philosophy, the people who are really interested in the nature of truth and justification, what were some of Galen's core ideas about how we can actually know things for sure?
Okay, so at the heart of Galen's epistemology is this fundamental idea of epidexis. Like we said, it's scientific demonstration. He believed that the best, most reliable kind of knowledge, what he called epistuma, could only come through this rigorous demonstrative method. And here's a key requirement. For Galen, any demonstration had to be built on premises that were taken from the essence itself. That's the ousia of the subject you're looking at. Now, the ousia, or essence, is that fundamental nature of something, what really makes it what it is. Think about a triangle, right? Its essence is having 3 sides and 3 angles. For Galen, trustworthy knowledge had to be built on understanding these core essences.
Essence, that's a very Aristotelian idea. How did Galen see that in practice?
You're right. It's definitely influenced by Aristotle. For Galen, the essence is closely tied to the definition of a thing. So any premise that makes a general claim about something, it has to be grounded in that thing's fundamental nature, its essential definition. Not just its random features or superficial stuff or even those misunderstandings that come from confusing language. On top of that, these basic premises have to be self-evident truths, stuff that's immediately clear and convincing, either to our reason or to our senses.
How did he actually go about building these demonstrations? What form did his arguments usually take?
Following Aristotle's logic, Galen aimed to present his demonstrations as syllogisms. And here's a great example, one that shows both his method and maybe some of its limitations. It's his big argument in the doctrines of Hippocrates and Plato about where the different parts of the soul are located. He argued that the rational part, the hegemon, is in the brain, the spirited part in the heart, and the desiring part in the liver. And he specifically said that the brain being the location of the hegemonicon, well, that could be scientifically demonstrated.
Let's hear it. How did that demonstration work?
Near the end of PHP, he sums up his main argument in this really concise syllogism. He says, where the source of the nerves is, there is the hegemonicon. But the source of the nerves is in the brain. The hegemonicon, then, is in the brain.
It sounds like a solid syllogism, logically speaking. But you mentioned earlier that there might be some issues with it if we hold it up to his own criteria for a valid demonstration. What are those issues?
Well, if we really break down the syllogism based on Galen's strict rules for apodeixis, that first premise, where the source of the nerves is, there is the hegemonicon, it's not necessarily a proposition that's self-evident just through reason alone, at least not in the same way that a definition should be. I mean, nerves aren't exactly part of our everyday understanding of what the hegemonicon is at its core. It feels like you need some empirical observation and reasoning to connect the two. And on the other hand, you can't just see that statement to be true through your senses alone. That's more like the second premise, which relies on anatomical observations about where nerves come from.
So it sounds like the line between what's evident to reason and what's evident to sense perception gets a little blurry here.
Exactly. Galen defines the hegemonicon earlier in the same work as, and I'm quoting here, the source of perception and of voluntary motion. His argument is basically taking this generally accepted definition and then showing that the brain fits that description. He uses evidence, some of it empirical, like anatomical observations, and some of it based on other widely held ideas or assumptions. But that jump from this agreed upon idea of the hegemonicon to that neat, formally structured syllogism, it's not always as clear-cut or self-evident as that formal presentation might suggest. It seems like those starting points taken directly from the Ugio, their role is more complex and less straightforward than that rigid syllogistic framework captures.
This raises a really interesting question about these evidence starting points.
Yeah.
How did Galen classify the different kinds of premises he used in his arguments?
Well, he actually came up with this hierarchy of arguments based on how reliable the premises were. Building on Aristotle and that whole Aristotelian tradition, he laid out 4 different grades of premises: epistemonic, dialectical, rhetorical, and sophistic. We can kind of ignore the sophistic ones here because they rely on word tricks and aren't really about getting to real knowledge. So epistemonic premises, those are the ones that come directly from the usai, from the essential nature of the thing. Dialectical premises are good for intellectual exercises, for refuting bad arguments and exploring possibilities, but they don't come directly from the essence. Rhetorical premises are the ones that come from commonly held opinions or beliefs, what they called endoxa. Everyday examples, inductive reasoning based on observations, or even what authoritative figures have said.
Okay, so where do his arguments for the spirited and deciderative parts of the soul, those ones located in the heart and liver, where do they fit into this hierarchy?
It's interesting, Galen didn't actually claim that he'd achieved these super strong epistemonic demonstrations for the heart being the location of the spirited part and the liver being the location of the deciderative part. He straight up said that those arguments, and I'm quoting here, do not possess such an evident demonstration like the one he made for the brain and the hegemonicon. Instead, those arguments relied on premises based on specific properties, what he called samebakota idei. He also used reasoning based on plausibility and analogy. For example, to back up his argument about the heart being connected to the spirited part, he pointed to the fact that our hearts beat differently when we feel things like anger or fear. And similarly, he linked the liver being the seat of desire to it being the main source of veins throughout the body. He was making an analogy to the trunk of a tree and all its branches.
So in those cases, it sounds like the evidence is less direct. It relies on correlations and analogies, not that strict demonstration from essence that he considered the gold standard. This makes me wonder, how rigid was that distinction between those different types of premises? Couldn't something that he considered to be coming straight from the essence of a thing actually just be a widely held opinion, an endoxin from a different point of view?
That's a really perceptive question, and it's key to understanding the subtleties of Galen's epistemology. Take that fundamental example of the hegemonicon being the source of both perception and voluntary motion. His main reason for accepting that as a starting point is that everyone agrees on it, even those who disagree about it being located in the brain. You could definitely argue that relying on universal agreement makes that premise an endoxin, a widely accepted belief. And this highlights how tricky it is to draw a perfectly clear, absolute line between these generally accepted beliefs, even those that seem intuitively obvious, and those undeniable, self-evident truths that come directly from the essence of something. Arguments based on consensus and what most people believe, they seem to play a big role in justifying what Galen considers to be evident to reason.
It's like his commitment to that ideal of rigorous demonstration sometimes bumped up against the messy reality of how arguments actually work and how we interpret what we observe.
Exactly. And we see those same challenges when we look at how he tried to demonstrate his basic physical theory, especially in his work Elements, according to Hippocrates. He's clearly going for a super rigorous logical method in his arguments, but it mainly leads him to refute atomism, as it was understood back then. He's essentially arguing that the universe has to be made of multiple fundamental things, not just these indivisible atoms. But then when he tries to argue for the specific number and nature of his preferred elements, earth, air, fire, and water, which he understood mostly as qualities, the argument gets a lot less straightforward and a lot less demonstrably certain. He definitely believed his theory was true, and he thought it could be logically deduced from clear facts and common ideas. But whether those deductions are actually valid, well, that's often up for debate.
So even though Galen was a huge fan of demonstration as the way to get to secure knowledge, even his own attempts to use this method show how tough it is to apply such a strict standard to the natural world, which is full of complexities.
That's right. And that ongoing tension between the ideal of reaching demonstrably certain knowledge and the more nuanced reality of actually doing science and philosophy, that's a key theme for anyone trying to understand the ins and outs of Galen's philosophical approach. It also sets the stage for understanding his views on the right way to investigate medical and scientific questions, which is a fascinating area we can dig into next.
Perfect. So let's talk about his methods. You mentioned he wasn't a fan of those school philosophers, right? So how did he position himself in the world of medical and scientific approaches?
He actually laid out his position pretty clearly in a work called On Sex for Beginners. It's this introductory text on different medical approaches written for new medical students in Rome. In it, he talks about these main groups, the dogmatists or rationalists, the empiricists, and the Methodists. And guess what? He kind of criticizes all of them.
He's just going against everyone, huh?
Yeah.
So what did he have against these different schools?
Well, the dogmatists, they put a lot of emphasis on reason and knowing the underlying causes of diseases, the hidden stuff. They were into dissecting animals to figure out how the body works and, develop theories based on those observations. But Galen thought they went too far with all the theorizing. He accused them of getting too caught up in abstract speculation and not paying enough attention to actual clinical experience.
So they weren't practical enough for him. What about the empiricists then?
The empiricists, they were all about observation and experience. They weren't so keen on fancy theories. They thought the best way to learn about medicine was to carefully watch what worked and what didn't. They'd build up their knowledge by observing patients and seeing how different treatments played out. But Galen, he thought they were missing something important. He argued that without some kind of theoretical framework, they were just blindly stumbling around. He thought you needed a solid understanding of how the body works, the physis, to really grasp why certain treatments work and to avoid making mistakes.
He sounds kind of like a pragmatist, taking what he saw as the good from each side. But what about the Methodists? You mentioned them earlier.
The Methodists. He had some strong opinions about them. They were all about keeping things simple. They stripped away a lot of the complexity that the dogmatists and empiricists were into. Their main idea was that diseases could be boiled down to these broad categories based on whether the body was too tense, too relaxed, or somewhere in between. They thought you could treat most things by just addressing those basic imbalances.
It sounds kind of appealing, keeping it simple. What was Galen's problem with them?
Oh, he thought they were way too simplistic. He called them the most mindless of men for ignoring all the detailed knowledge that had been built up about anatomy and physiology. He thought their approach was shallow and ultimately dangerous because, it didn't account for all the real complexities of the human body and how diseases actually work.
So where did that leave him? If he wasn't fully on board with any of these schools, what was his own take on how to approach medical knowledge?
Galen saw himself as charting a middle course. He believed you needed both careful observation and a solid theoretical framework grounded in an understanding of the body's internal workings. He also stressed the importance of logic and reason in organizing and interpreting medical knowledge. But crucially, he wasn't a rigid dogmatist. He was open to revising his theories based on new evidence and experience. He was a big believer in learning from your mistakes and constantly refining your understanding.
This all feeds back into that strong emphasis on demonstration we were talking about earlier. But he also seemed aware of the limits of what you could demonstrate conclusively, especially in areas like medicine. How did he deal with those situations where you couldn't achieve that level of certainty?
Yeah, good point. You see this play out really clearly in how he thought about the different levels of certainty you could have in knowledge. In one of his works, The Best Teaching, he takes on academic skepticism, which basically argued that you can't really know anything for sure. And he also challenges the Stoic idea of the cataleptic impression, which was supposed to be this totally clear and undeniable perception that guaranteed truth. Galen wasn't buying it. He thought there were certain things you could know with a high degree of confidence.
What kinds of things? What were those bedrock pieces of knowledge for him?
For Galen, it came down to those fundamental intuitions we have about the world and our basic sensory perceptions. Things that are, as he put it, ex autopista, self-evident. Like the fact that I'm talking to you right now, or that 2 + 2 = 4. These are things that, under normal circumstances, we don't really doubt. But he recognized that people disagree about all sorts of things, even seemingly obvious stuff, and he had a really interesting explanation for that.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What was his take on why we have so much disagreement if these basic intuitions are so reliable?
He thought it all boiled down to how well-trained our evaluative faculty is. He used this Greek term, kritorion, which refers to the part of us that judges and makes decisions about what's true or false, good or bad. He argued that everyone's born with this natural kritorion, but it needs to be trained and refined just like any other skill. He even compared it to becoming a musician or a gymnast. You might have natural talent, but you need practice and guidance to really master it.
So it's like he was saying that some people are just better at evaluating evidence and reaching accurate conclusions because they've honed that skill over time.
Right. And he argued that those who haven't trained their Praetorian properly, they're more likely to make mistakes and cling to false beliefs. They might misinterpret their senses or get tricked by faulty reasoning. He thought this explained why, even though our basic perceptions are generally reliable, we still end up with all these disagreements and conflicting opinions.
This whole idea of a trained criterion, it makes a lot of sense. But how did it apply to his medical practice?
In medicine, it was all about what he called qualified experience, or ditchersme no periwa. He argued that just observing stuff wasn't enough. You needed a framework to make sense of what you're seeing. That framework for him was a solid understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the principles of humoral theory. You had to use your reason to filter and interpret those empirical observations. Otherwise, you were just collecting random data without really getting to the heart of what was going on.
So even experience itself needs to be qualified, guided by reason, and a solid theoretical understanding. But going back to those limitations of demonstration, how did he approach areas where you couldn't achieve absolute certainty?
He acknowledged that, in the messy world of biology and medicine, you don't always get those perfectly clean demonstrations like you do in math or geometry. He loved to use the example of the sundial. You can demonstrate with absolute certainty how it works based on geometry and the movement of the sun. But the human body, well, it's way more complicated. And he admitted that there were limits to what you could prove with that same level of rigor. But he wasn't a skeptic. He still believed that you could reach reliable knowledge in those areas, even if you couldn't get to that ultimate level of demonstrative certainty.
So what was the key? How did he think you could achieve that reliable knowledge when a strict demonstration wasn't possible?
It came down to those same principles we've been talking about. Using your trained senses to make careful observations, applying logic and reason to organize your knowledge, and crucially, starting from those well-established, generally accepted principles. He thought that even in fields like element theory or pharmacology, where those strict demonstrations were hard to come by, you could still develop a pretty solid understanding of how things worked. He had a real confidence in the power of human reason, combined with empirical observation, to get to the truth, even in those complex areas.
It's interesting. I mean, today we have a pretty clear distinction between scientific knowledge and clinical practice. But for Galen, these things were very much connected. How did he see that connection play out when it came to actually treating patients?
Right. He recognized that there's a difference between having general knowledge about, say, how a particular disease works, and applying that knowledge to a specific patient in front of you. He talked about this challenge of going from the universal, or Cathalu, to the particular, the idion. You might know a lot about the theory of a disease, but each patient is unique, and their individual circumstances can influence how that disease manifests and how they'll respond to treatment.
So how did he bridge that gap? How did he move from those general principles to making decisions about an individual patient's care?
He emphasized the importance of what he called inference from signs, or endeixis. It's like a form of medical reasoning where you're looking for clues, those subtle signs and symptoms that tell you what's really going on with the patient. And he stressed that this kind of knowledge you gain from experience, from actually working with patients, it's different from the kind of knowledge you get from a strict demonstration. It's more intuitive, more holistic. It's about recognizing patterns and making judgments based on a whole range of factors that you can't always capture in a neat logical formula.
So it's almost like this art of medicine, using your experience and intuition to make those subtle judgments that go beyond just applying general principles.
Yeah, exactly. And he even said that some of the most important insights you get from clinical practice, they're not things you can put into words easily. They're based on this tacit knowledge that you develop from years of experience. It's like that gut feeling a doctor might have about a patient based on all the subtle cues they pick up on that don't necessarily show up in a textbook.
It's fascinating to see how we recognize the limits of purely theoretical knowledge when it came to the art of healing. It's a good reminder that knowledge takes many forms. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about this idea of scientific progress. How did he see his own work fitting into the broader history of intellectual inquiry?
That's a great question. It's important to understand that Galen, like many intellectuals of his time, held this view that there had been a decline from the brilliance of the ancients, especially someone like Hippocrates, whom he really admired. He saw himself as, in a way, reviving and building upon the wisdom of those earlier thinkers. And he did claim to have made progress in two key ways.
Okay, so how did he see himself advancing the frontiers of knowledge?
First, he believed he'd made specific discoveries, particularly in anatomy. He'd done dissections and made observations that went beyond what earlier thinkers had documented. And second, he thought he'd given a more rigorous, demonstrative form to many of the propositions that the ancients had either stated less formally or had simply omitted. He saw himself as bringing clarity and logical structure to those earlier insights.
So it's a combination of new discoveries and like systematizing and strengthening existing knowledge. But he was also heavily engaged with the work of earlier thinkers, especially Hippocrates and Plato. He wrote extensive commentaries on their texts. How did he balance that respect for authority with his own drive to innovate?
That's a really interesting tension in Galen's work. You see both deep admiration for those figures, especially Hippocrates, and a willingness to engage critically with their ideas. He didn't shy away from pointing out what he saw as errors or inconsistencies in their thinking, and sometimes it seems like he's trying to reinterpret their ideas to fit his own theoretical framework. It's a complex relationship.
Yeah, I mean, in his writings, he seems to explicitly reject the idea of relying on arguments from authority, yet he's constantly referencing those big names.
Right, it's kind of paradoxical. On one hand, he says things like, we should not believe in the ancients if their opinions are not in accordance with nature. He's really emphasizing the importance of observation and independent judgment, but on the other hand, he can't resist using those same authorities to bolster his own arguments. It's like those figures still hold a certain persuasive power for him and his audience, even when he's explicitly denying that he's relying on their authority.
It seems like a pretty common human tendency. We all have those figures we look up to, even when we think we're being totally independent in our thinking. It's like those voices are always in the background somewhere.
It's true. And it's a good reminder that, even the most brilliant minds are products of their time and those intellectual traditions that shape them. And Galen, he was deeply immersed in that world of classical Greek thought. But let's move on to another fascinating area, his work in logic. This is an area where he made some pretty bold claims.
Yeah, he claimed to have made some additions to Aristotle's logic, right? Which is a pretty audacious move. So what were those contributions, and how significant were they?
This is a bit of a tricky area. There's a lot of debate among scholars about how original Galen's contributions to logic really were and what his final views on some of these issues actually ended up being. One of his big claims was that he added this 11th category, composition, to Aristotle's famous 10 categories. He also might have been the first to propose a fourth figure in syllogistic logic, but there's some debate about whether that idea was really his, and even if it was, how valuable it actually is.
So there are some question marks around those specific contributions. What else did he do in the realm of logic?
He did some really interesting work on what are called compound syllogisms, which are essentially chains of reasoning where the conclusion of one syllogism becomes the premise of another. He even references Plato when he's talking about this stuff, which is kind of cool. He also engaged with the Stoics and their system.